It all depends where you want me to start. Way back in the 50s, which tells you how old I am, and when I was 14, wanted to be a photographer because I thought that way I could photograph film stars and have affairs with them, which would be just wonderful. And at that time, I was head over heels in love with, guess who, Laurence Olivier. So I left school when I was 14 and a half and went and trained as a photographer. I did it for 3 years. And in fact, I was the only person in my year to have a job afterwards. So what did I do? I didn't go off and photograph Laurence Olivier. I photographed kittens in baskets for birthday cards and horses looking over stable doors laughing and flowers for Mother's Day. And it was so boring, I can't tell you. So then I took a job showing American tourists around London in a car. I loved that because I was talking to them about a place I loved and it was great fun. And then I realised that some of my other fellow guides were really quite interesting people. They had far more interesting backgrounds than I did and lots more to talk about. And they'd all been to Oxford and Cambridge and done university and things which nobody in my family had done. And I thought they were rather attractive, especially the chaps, you know. So I thought, right, go to university. It took me another 3 years to get there, and I did A-levels. I had 2 goes at doing A-levels. First time I dropped out. Second time, I actually fell in love with my sociology tutor. And as the result of doing sociology, I then thought, right, I've gone off all this business about photography and things like that. Although I had, in the intervening years, worked for a very interesting documentary film producer, so I still kept up a vague bit of interest. Then, what did I do after that? I trained to be a teacher because I suddenly became passionate about education, having got myself to university and realising how it widened my horizons and introduced me to fabulous people and all the rest of it. So what did I want to do but to introduce the rest of the world to this great discovery? So I thought teaching. But I had a big social conscience and I was also a very strong feminist, although one of the few feminists that ever existed who wore false eyelashes top and bottom. So, you know, there was a bit of a paradox there. But anyway, I got very involved in community politics in the 70s and I set up a parent-run children's nursery and nursery school, because in those days the 2 institutions were separate. I thought they should be brought together, and I thought that mums who had to work shouldn't be deprived of an education for their children. So I changed all that, set up a centre which survived for about 30 years afterwards. And it was great. We had a youth club there and I loved working with the kids. We had a nursery thing, we had women's groups, we did courses and this, that and the other. And then one day a lovely Australian man arrived and he said, would you like to run some courses in your parent and baby's outfit here? And I said yes, and he roped me into adult education, which in those days was something really wonderful. It was considered to be the poor cousin of proper education, but actually it was about opening up opportunities for people who'd never had educational opportunities before. I left the children's centre and I started working full-time in adult education, which I did for about 12 years, ending up locally here in North Kensington as head of the local adult education centre, which ran courses really in everything. My priority was education and enabling people who'd missed out on opportunities to make the best of them. So you can see I've always been in the same kind of work because I've been matching people up with possibilities. So all this time I was working in education, community politics and all the other things I've done. I skipped a few, by the way. I was also a model for a bit. And but anyway, getting back to the serious stuff, I'd always enjoyed fixing things up for people, whether it was finding homes for kittens, flats for friends, or boyfriends or girlfriends for my best friends. And I had a secret desire to run an introduction agency, but there were none in those days. One day I was walking along the street near the British Museum and I saw this bookshop which was called Drawing Down the Moon. And it said bookshop and dating agency. So of course I went straight in, introduced myself to the woman who was running it, who was called Mary. And she was an Irish woman. And of course the Irish have a great tradition of matchmaking. You may not know about this, but they do. And she had been a librarian, was very interested in writing and poetry and books, and had set up this bookshop. And you could buy feminist books, political books, poetry, latest literature. And downstairs was the dating agency. So you'd go in ostensibly to buy a book and you'd come out with a few dates. So I thought, I love this. So I said to her, Mary, if ever you want to sell, please let me know, because this is what I really want to do. And during the next year, I was hatching plots. I thought, I'm going to leave my job because at that time, the government was cutting funding for what I was doing, and I was having to sack tutors, I was having to say no to community groups, I was having to close classes which didn't have a particularly large attendance. The fun and the passion was being sorely tried. So I thought, I've got to move on. I've been doing it for too long. And I've always had an entrepreneurial streak. I've always loved fixing people up. So it seemed perfect. And I'll never forget the day I told the first person I was going to do this. I was sitting with my young stepdaughter and I was in the car with her and I said to her, what are you going to be when you're grown up? And she said, well, you tell me what you're going to do when you're grown up first. So I said, yes, all right then. So I immediately said, I'm going to be a matchmaker. Anyway, meanwhile, I gave my notice in and I set up the structure for an introduction agency. In fact, it was called Play It Again, Sam. No, just Play It Again, I think. That's right. And while I was doing that, the owner of Drawing Down the Moon phoned me up. She'd had a baby, she couldn't manage the baby and the bookshop and the dating agency. Did I want to buy? So I sold half of this house to my husband, my new husband, and bought the agency and moved it away from the bookshop, which was really, it was too much, not private enough either. So I moved it to Kensington. And ultimately we moved it to Adam and Eve Muse, which of course is brilliant. And I put that on the cover of my book, which you can see, my smart dating book. Basically, it's gone from strength to strength ever since. It's a niche agency. We don't take everybody on. It doesn't work for everybody. And we only take people on if we think we can match. That was in 1986 that I bought it. And that is now 24 years ago. And the agency, of course, has been going for 26 or 27 years. So we were the very first introduction agency. On your way here, you possibly passed 10 or 15 people you could have spent the rest of your life with, but there's nobody to introduce you. So in Drawing Down the Moon, we make sure you get introduced to lots of possibles. And if we match you up and it works, it's interesting that people don't always tell us straight away. We often hear about it a year or 20 years later, seriously. And when you get that phone call or that Christmas card with the photograph of the children, or the honeymoon pictures or the wedding pictures, that is just wonderful. It really is.